Okay, well, let's move ahead here. We are in the book of Daniel, and a little bit of a change on this slide. Never fear, we are still hopefully going to finish the book by the end of November, but we are slowing down a little bit for a couple reasons, but regardless of what those are specifically, we are going to review a little bit tonight, some things we've talked about over the last class period or so, and then we're going to talk about the first major part of chapter 9 and have quite a bit of discussion about it because I think it's worth discussing. And then on next Wednesday, we'll do the rest of chapter 9, which is the real difficult 70 weeks prophecy, probably the hardest passage in Daniel, maybe even the whole Old Testament, depending on who you ask. So we'll reserve that for next week and then use that to move into chapter 10 and then use our last couple class periods to tackle chapters 11 and 12. So let's go over what I was asking you in the pre-class review here. Again, basic answers. In chapter 2, there was a statue. And what did that statue represent? Remember, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. Daniel interpreted the dream. In that dream, Nebuchadnezzar saw a statue, multi-parted, multicolored, composite statue. What did it represent? Four kingdoms. Okay, that's it. Simple. Now, if I ask you more detail about the nature of the statue itself, what are the four parts of the statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw? The statue itself. Yeah, give me the specifics here. Okay, a head of gold. Yeah, a chest of silver, thighs of bronze, and feet of iron, iron and clay mixed together by the time you get to the feet, so on and so forth, okay? And then what happens to that statue? What's the next thing that shows up in the vision? A stone. And the stone does what? Yeah, it crushes the statue to dust, basically. And statue's no more. The stone is the only thing that's left. Now, the other thing I asked you about chapter 2 is that in chapter 2, we are given, the interpretation is that there's four kingdoms, right? But Daniel gives one historical parallel and says that, there's one kingdom we know for sure from the text of the four kingdoms that are listed in the statue, if that makes any sense. And what kingdom do we know for sure is on the statue? Babylon. He tells Nebuchadnezzar, you are the head of gold, right? So we know that Babylon is the head of gold. So that's what we know about chapter 2. We know the other kingdoms are successive kingdoms after that. All right, I also asked you about chapter 7 and the beasts that now Daniel is seeing in his vision. And what do those beasts represent? Four kingdoms, okay? Now, this is probably a little bit harder than the statue, but see if we can work through what the four beasts are. Okay, a lion with eagle's wings. A bear that's like lifted up on one side. He's eating barbecue, right? He's got three ribs in his mouth. Next, a leopard that's also got wings, I believe. And then the terrible beast that we're not told what it is. Now, the question I asked you in the review, follow-up question is, if chapter 7 is kind of lining up nicely with chapter 2 in terms of the elements of the vision, what is the parallel to the stone of chapter 2? What is the parallel in chapter 7? In chapter 2, we have statue, which is four kingdoms, and then boom, stone, statue's gone. In chapter 7, we have four beasts, four kingdoms, and then... So, what did you say, Albert? Yeah, so Albert's saying the presence of God, and that's actually figured in two different ways, and I think they can both work. But what are the two ways that God is described, or at least that a divine being is described? So first we see the Ancient of Days sitting on the throne. Four beasts, and then boom, we see the Ancient of Days sitting on the throne. It's actually at that point that the beasts are done away with. But then after that, we see another divine being, the one like the Son of Man, okay? I'm going to use that here as our corollary. Although, again, I think Ancient of Days works, and most generally you could say Daniel sees God and God's rule and reign. Okay, so that's the corollary to the stone, which is the kingdom of God from chapter 2. Okay, now I also asked you about chapter 8. Yeah.
The lion with wings is the corollary representing Babylon.
We'll come back to that. We'll come back. Yes, you can already tell where we're going because of the color-coded nature of the chart and the symmetry of it. But we'll come back to it because part of what I want to do with this review exercise here is show you how we piece together what is what based on the limited clues that we have. You ever do those like logic puzzles, right? Our friend who used to visit here, Tom Mizzou, he subscribed me to the Reader's Digest. So now every month or two I get the Reader's Digest. And there's the puzzles in the back, the Reader's Digest. They have these logic puzzles that give you kind of clues, right? The one this month was 6 people are eating Thanksgiving dinner. One of them's thankful for this and this and this. And they give you clues, such and such person doesn't have any kids. This person is retired. How do you use the limited clues to line up everybody and what they're thankful for? All right. Man, talk about a diversion here. So in this case, back to what Brian asked, we're not told in every vision this thing in the vision is this kingdom. This is this kingdom. We're given limited clues, but I'm showing you how we can kind of piece it together and figure out more based on what we're given. So in chapter 8, we have another vision that Daniel sees, this time of animals that are a little more realistic maybe than the ones from chapter 7. And there's only 2 of them, right? There's a ram and a goat. We're told, actually, so I'll just give you the ram here, ram and the goat. We're told, actually, in the text what they represent. What do they represent?
Greece.
Yeah, in the other order, right? So the ram with horns is the Medo-Persian Empire. We're told that. And the goat with the big horn that goes so fast he's not even touching the ground represents the kingdom of the Greeks. Okay, so this is basically how we use the clues to match everything up. Remember that in chapter 8, we're told that Daniel is seeing this vision while he's still in the Babylonian Empire. Okay, it's still in the days of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. So that would follow that the vision of the kingdoms that are coming, right, that he sees, the ram and the goat, are the next 2 kingdoms to come. You're going to see one come from the east, that's Persia. You're going to see one then from the west, that's Greece, right? So if we then kind of fold that back on top of the other visions that describe Babylon and then 3 successive kingdoms, then we can conclude that the kingdoms of chapter 2 and chapter 7 are Babylon first, and then the Medo-Persians, then the Greeks, and then another kingdom. And this one is never named. So we need to be clear about that. This one is not named in the book of Daniel, but I think we can pretty safely assume, based on the events of world history, that it's the Roman Empire, the Romans that come after the Greeks. Okay? Does this make sense, how we're doing this here? Okay. Any questions about this? By the way, there are other clues that you can use. It's not all just a wild speculation. There are connections between the visions, right? Things that match them up. Like, for instance, here, remember the leopard of chapter 7, the beast, had those wings. I mean, speed is clearly what's being, insinuated with the leopard that has wings. And the speed of the goat is what's emphasized there as well. And I think there's something about 4, right, with the leopard in chapter 7. Am I remembering that right? Maybe not. Yeah, 4 heads of the leopard. And remember, the goat has the 1 horn that breaks into 4 horns, right? We talked about Alexander's kingdom breaking into 4 parts, okay? So you can match up other little elements that would show you, hey, the animal that Daniel sees in chapter 8 is supposed to be linked with the beast from chapter 7, and you can match things up that way as well. Okay? All right. Yeah, Albert.
So that we don't need to go down the rabbit hole that I just showed. In chapter 2, the feet of iron and clay, it mentions that they're blended corrupted and they're lost and they're not pure, and then the terrible beast and its ugly design and teeth of iron and all. Does it later on give us any more insight into things, or just the purpose of it, those having similar description?
Really, the real answer is I don't know. As far as I know, the detail from chapter 2 about the weakness of the fourth kingdom, I don't know if or where that is kind of paralleled in the beast of chapter 7. There is a connection with the iron. So remember, it's feet of iron, and then the terrible beast has jaws of iron or whatever, right? It's a teeth of iron. So that even that one word kind of links those two together. And maybe if you're looking for things, remember in chapter 7 it says some about the 10 horns of that fourth beast, and then one rises up and supplants 3 of them, right? So there's kind of this idea of infighting and overthrowing each other. So maybe that is tied back into the weakness of the feet of iron and clay, because it's a mixed or divided kingdom, as the text says there. But good question, and I don't really know the answer. Okay. There's one other thing that I asked you about, which is about chapter 8. And the question was, in chapter 8, which has the ram and the goat, what ends up receiving most of the attention of Daniel and of the text in chapter 8? Is it the ram or the goat?
I think it's Greece.
Yeah, it's actually the horn. It comes from the goat, but there's this little horn in chapter 8 that receives most of the attention. I just want to read these verses again, just to kind of remind ourselves of them, not necessarily for tonight, but for future classes. So in the vision that Daniel sees, in verses 9 to 14, it says, out of one of the horns of the goat, so the goat has one horn that breaks into 4, and out of one of those comes a little horn, which grew exceedingly great towards the south, towards the east, and towards the glorious land. It grew great even to the host of heaven, and some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of hosts, and the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown, and a host will be given over to it, together with the regular burnt offering, because of transgression. And it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, for how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary, and the host to be trampled underfoot? And he said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. Okay. In very general terms, I'm not asking for in-depth analysis or, historical, connections here. In very general terms, how is this little horn described? What's the impression you're getting about this little horn that's described in the vision? He's what? He's an oppressor. He's powerful. What did you say, Patty? No, say he's everywhere. Okay. He's what, Brian?
Exceedingly great.
Exceedingly great. Let's look at some of the phrases. Remind ourselves some of the phrases here. Okay. He says this little horn is moving in a couple different directions, but he's moving towards the glorious land. And we're going to surmise, we did this last week, that the glorious land is what? Canaan, Jerusalem, Judah, the land of God's people. And there's at least one other reference from the prophets that would use that language about Judah or Jerusalem there in Ezekiel. Okay, but he is so great, he can trample on the host of heaven, it says. You see some references in this chapter to that kind of language about, destroying maybe kingdoms or even competing with heavenly powers or something. Okay. In verse 11, it says that he overthrows the sanctuary. What do we want to maybe guess the sanctuary is? The temple, okay? You guys know these answers. These are not as hard, I think, as you think they are, right? Glorious land, land of Israel. Sanctuary, temple, okay? And he's even going to, it says in verse 11 and 12, remove the regular offering. He's going to throw truth to the ground. And this will last for a certain period of time. Okay, we don't have to go into all that right now. All I want to do here is give you a general picture of this little horn. Okay, it's what you guys all said. He's great, he's powerful, he's terrifying, but particularly he is terrifying to whom? God's people. Okay, God's people, the people in the glorious land, the people that would be in the sanctuary, the people that would be involved in the regular offerings. Okay, they're the ones that are the victims of this little horn and all of his oppressive powerfulness. Okay, so in the interpretation, we're told similar things. We're told, by the way, that this is going to happen because of transgression, because the transgressors are going to reach their limit. I'm going to assume that's the transgressions of God's people. Okay, but he's going to be a king of bold face. He's going to destroy mighty men and saints. He's going to rise up against the prince of princes. Maybe that's God himself going to rebel in God's face, right? Spit in his eye. And then he will be broken. In verse 25, this little horn, this mighty king will be broken, and it will happen by no human hand, right? It'll be God's doing. This oppressor will be done away with, right? So I said this last week. In some ways, we don't really need to talk a whole lot more about this because this is all going to come back up in chapter 11. And the historical figure here, just to say it now, and we'll come back to it in a couple weeks, Antiochus Epiphanes is the guy's name. He is of the Seleucid dynasty, which is one of the little kingdoms that follows in the days after Alexander the Great's Hellenistic or Greek kingdom is broken up into 4 parts. Okay, I'll show you a map in just a second. Right? But there's going to be more of that to come, more of this particular person described and talked about in chapter 11. So the Seleucids had this territory in the eastern portion of Alexander's kingdom, and you see that they, as well as the Ptolemies here, are kind of straddling the glorious land here, Israel and Judah. And so they'll be kicking that back and forth like a football over the course of a few centuries. But Antiochus is of the Seleucids, and he will be the oppressor that will make life miserable for the Jews in Jerusalem. Now, yeah. And you'll notice here with the dates that we're talking about a time that is not in Daniel's lifetime. It's not even really in the days following Daniel. This is going to be several centuries later. And we're getting pretty close to where BC becomes AD, right? I mean, 160s, 170s, 160s BC. We're only a couple centuries out at that point from the coming of Jesus. So this is time, we call this the intertestamental time period. But Daniel is seeing visions of things that are going to happen to God's people during this time period. And if you look at this list here and look at the text of Daniel 8, it's not really a pretty picture, right? What's going to happen is horrible. It's going to be terrifying. It's going to be scary, right? And I think, just to come back to it one more time, the 2,300 mornings and evenings, whatever that means, it definitely means it's a temporary time. It's not forever. It's a time, but it's a short time. And again, this oppressor's power will be broken at some point. God will finally intervene on behalf of his people and do away with this oppressive ruler. Okay. Now, some of that was just to review chapter 8, because I felt like we rushed some of it last week. But it also sets up a theory that we've been working with here in terms of the kind of the outline or the message of the book of Daniel. Remember that in the book of Daniel, the first 6 chapters are stories. The second 6 chapters, the back half of the book, is visions. But there's really another way that we want to break up the content of the book. Because after a prologue in chapter 1, remember that the text of Daniel changes language. It's like the only place in the Old Testament where this happens. But the next 6 chapters are written in a different language. They're written in Aramaic. And our suggestion has been that because Aramaic is a more universal language, that, and this is back to Lee's question that he asked, I would say this, even if no one else was really reading it, the fact that it changes to a more universal language is, if nothing else, a stylistic move to say the theme of this section is more universal. The theme of this section is supposed to apply more broadly than just to God's people. And I do still think there is a good chance that other people were would have read this, or at least could have read it. But because it's an Aramaic and it's a more universal language, there is a more universal message in chapters 2 through 7. And that theme, that message is that God rules in the kingdoms of man. Okay, no matter who you are, Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, Darius, God is the ruler, and he is the one that is shuffling through these kingdoms one after another. But when we get to chapter 8, which we've just spent all that time reviewing, we're back to the text being in the Hebrew language, that was read, understood by the Hebrews themselves, by the Jews, and really by the Jews alone. And so our theory in this class is that this last section of the book has a more particular focus, that its theme and message is not so broad as for the whole world or for a broader audience, but it's more narrow in its focus, and it is particularly about God's people themselves, about the Jews, and about what's going to happen to the Jews in the coming centuries. And as chapter 8 has previewed for us, because chapter 8 kicks off this final section, chapter 8 has previewed for us that the coming centuries are not going to be very great at times for God's people. And so that's maybe why this message is so important, because things are going to turn a bit nasty. And so this back half of the book of Daniel would be a reminder to the Jews who had this text that God was doing all this because he has a plan and because he is ultimately going to take care of them. Okay, does that make sense? Any questions on that? Yes, Ian. Really, just chapters 2 to 7 has that chiastic, parallel structure. There may be other things that I'm not aware of that tie the whole book together. Was there something you were? No, yeah, and I will say this to your point. I've made a comment about it. I've seen other people make the comment that chapter 7 is in many ways like the linchpin of the book of Daniel, right? Because chapter 7 straddles that line where it is a vision like the rest of the book, okay? But its message fits really going all the way back to chapter 2, as we've seen, paralleling chapter 2. The message of chapter 7 is the nations come and go, right? But God sits on the throne forever, okay? So, yeah, you could probably use the logic you're using there about the structure of the whole book, right, and the symmetry of it, could definitely be used to support chapter 7 being the kind of centerpiece and linchpin of the whole book. Is this okay? Other questions? Okay, and we're only 10 minutes behind schedule, so great. This is what happens. This is the danger of purposely slowing down. Sometimes you purposely slow down, then you go too slow, and then you have to go fast and catch up. Okay. So let's get into Daniel chapter 9. And by the way, going back to this, it's going to be obvious when we start chapter 9 that we're focusing on God's people here. Okay, we've left the nations and that broad big picture, nations of the world. We're getting real, singularly focused here on the Jews and God's relationship with the Jewish people. That's really what chapter 9 is about, especially this first part here and the prayer that Daniel offers. So let's read it, and then I have some questions that I want you guys to discuss, and that'll really be what we'll do for most of the rest of our time. Chapter 9 of Daniel. In the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, by descent a Mede, who was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, perceived in the books the numbers of years that, according to the word of the Lord, the prophet Jeremiah, must pass before the end of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. Verse 3, Then I turned my face to the Lord God, seeking him by prayer and pleas for mercy with fasting and sackcloth and ashes. I prayed to the Lord my God and made confession, saying, O Lord, the great and awesome God, who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments, we have sinned have done wrong and acted wickedly and rebelled, turning aside from your commandments and rules. We have not listened to your servants, the prophets, who spoke in your name to our kings, our princes, and our fathers, and to all the people of the land. To you, O Lord, belong righteousness, but to us open shame. And as at this day, to the men of Judah, to the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and to all of Israel, those who are near and those who are far away, in all the lands to which you have driven them, because of the treachery that they have committed against you. To us, O Lord, belongs open shame, to our kings, to our princes, to our fathers, because we have sinned against you. To the Lord our God belong mercy and forgiveness, for we have rebelled against him, and have not obeyed the voice of the Lord our God by walking in his laws, which is set before us by his servants the prophets. All Israel has transgressed your law and turned aside, refusing to obey your voice. And the curse and oath that are written in the law of Moses that the servant of God has poured out on us, because we have sinned against him. He has confirmed his words, which he spoke against us and against our rulers who ruled us, by bringing upon us a great calamity. For under the whole heaven there has not been done anything like what has been done against Jerusalem. As it is written in the law of Moses, all this calamity has come upon us. Yet we have not entreated the favor of the Lord our God, turning from our iniquities and gaining insight by your truth. Therefore the Lord has kept ready the calamity and has brought it upon us. For the Lord our God is righteous in all the works that he has done, and we have not obeyed his voice. And now, O Lord our God, who brought your people out of the land of Egypt with a mighty hand, and have made a name for yourself, as at this day we have sinned, we have done wickedly. O Lord, according to all your righteous acts, let your anger and your wrath turn away from your city Jerusalem, your holy hill, because of our sins and for the iniquities of our fathers. Jerusalem and your people have become a byword among all who are around us. Now therefore, O our God, listen to the prayer of your servant and to his pleas for mercy. For your own sake, O Lord, make your face shine upon your sanctuary, which is desolate. O my God, incline your ear and hear. Open your eyes and see our desolations and the city that is called by your name. We do not present our pleas before you because of our righteousness, but because of your great mercy. O Lord, hear. O Lord, forgive. O Lord, pay attention and act. Delay not for your own sake, O my God, because your city and your people are called by your name. Okay, I want you guys to discuss amongst yourselves first, because I want everybody to have a chance to jump in here because of how important I think this is. Talk amongst yourselves about this for a few minutes. What impresses you about Daniel's prayer? And along with that, what lessons should we learn from Daniel chapter 9 and his prayer recorded here for our own prayers? What impresses you? What lessons do we learn? Discuss that for a few minutes with those that you're sitting by, and then we'll share out in just a minute. Share out. What are some things you talked about or you thought of about this prayer? What impresses you about it? And what lessons are there for us to learn here? Brian, you got a lot of time to make up for, so kick us off here.
You missed it.
We did.
Well, obviously,
Okay, thank you, Brian. 70 years are coming to an end. Daniel recognizes from his Bible reading, asking God for mercy, confessing the sinfulness of the people. What else stood out to you? Impress you about this prayer, things we take for ourselves. Thank you, Ian. So Daniel's saying there's we all throughout, right, including himself, taking responsibility. That surprise anybody? I mean, if anybody, right, could stand aside and say, look at these people, right, I'm not one of them, but look at these. I mean, Daniel, I think John pointed this out. We don't have anything negative said about Daniel, the whole book, right? But no, we're all in this together. We're all in the same boat, right? Yeah. Thank you, Doug. So Doug's connecting verse 3, fasting, sackcloth, the mourning, and then verse 18, not because of our righteousness. I'm not asking because of our righteousness. I'm asking because of your mercy. Thank you, Doug. And to me, it's kind of I was reminded in his comment about the Pharisee, the people in Jesus' day, they would do the fasting and the sackcloth, and they would kind of use that then to say, look at how righteous we are because we're doing the fasting and sackcloth. Daniel's doing it the right way. The fasting and the sackcloth is just an outward expression of his true humility and brokenness of spirit, right? Blessed are those who mourn, right? This is Daniel chapter 9. Thank you, Albert. Albert talks about this being a lament, which it absolutely is. And that being something that maybe a little foreign to us, right? But it's a powerful, it's a necessary thing. And I'll refrain from preaching a sermon here, but I mean, I think Daniel chapter 9, that's right. We don't pray prayers like this, and maybe we should. By the way, one of those cool tricks of the way our Bible is broken up. There's 3 9s in the exilic or post-exilic books: Daniel 9, Ezra 9, and Nehemiah 9. Right? There's 3 great prayers of the Old Testament: 9, 9, 9. Daniel 9, Ezra 9, Nehemiah 9. But to Albert's point, that's our homework assignment. Go read those prayers and pray those prayers, and try to shape our prayers in the mode of these great prayers of the Bible. Thank you, Steve. Yeah, the honesty here. I mean, Brian mentioned Ezekiel. That's a good connect. This is the language of Ezekiel. There is no sugarcoating or glossing over any of the sins here in Daniel's prayer. To us belongs open shame. All of us, from top to bottom, have rebelled and against God. Okay, a lot more we could say about that. I just think this prayer in Daniel 9 is very powerful, and again, it's worth spending more time with than what we have time to do here in this class. But I do want to point a few things out. So we have about 5 minutes left here, I think. Brian mentioned this earlier. But this whole chapter is kicked off with a time marker. So this is when the Babylonian Empire has fallen, and Darius or Cyrus, again, we're working off of the assumption that that's the same person in the book of Daniel. Darius has taken over, right? Darius the Mede from chapter 5 it is. And Daniel, it says in verse 2, is reading and remembered or comes across the number of years that the exile would be from the book of Jeremiah, 70 years. And so that prompts him to pray this prayer. So there's a few important passages. Maybe you jot down if you jot it in your margin, or jot it down if you're taking notes. The passages for context of Daniel chapter 9. One, which I just put there because I think it's kind of foundational to everything in the Old Testament, is what some have referred to as the John 3:16 of the Old Testament. It's referred to, or at least quoted or alluded to all the time, but it's the famous passage when God is speaking to Moses. He's actually appearing to Moses. He's passing by him in the cleft of the rock in chapter 34, and he is speaking his name to Moses, telling Moses, this is who I am. This is the definition of who Jehovah, who Yahweh is, and it's this: Yahweh, Yahweh, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. Steve actually referenced this passage in a sermon not too long ago talking about mercy, which is kind of the New Testament word for the word here, hesed, which in the ESV is steadfast love. Yours may say loving kindness if you're using the New American Standard. But that's used 2 times. In verse 6, right, abounding in steadfast love. In verse 7, keeping steadfast love. That is a statement about God's faithfulness. That's really what Exodus 34, 6 and 7 is. God is faithful. His love, his commitment to his people, his commitment to the covenant is unchanging. And you see that in these verses because that faithfulness carries with it both the forgiveness, right, and the mercy shown to those in the covenant, but also the accountability and the justice of holding the sins against people when they commit it. Why? Because God is faithful. He is committed to his covenant and to his people. But moving more specifically towards Daniel chapter 9. At the end of Leviticus, in this section of Leviticus that we've talked about before that has to do with the blessings and the curses of the covenant, in Leviticus 26, it says that if the people disobey God, God's going to send pestilence and sword and all these terrible things on them. And if they still don't listen, finally, in spite of all the things that God has done, Leviticus 26, verse 27, in spite of this, you won't listen to me and you walk contrary. Then, let's see, verse 31, I will lay your cities waste and make your sanctuaries desolate. right? Think Jerusalem being destroyed. I will make your sanctuaries desolate. I will not smell your pleasing aromas. I will devastate the land so that your enemies who settle in it shall be appalled at it. I will scatter you among the nations. Think the exile. I will unsheath the sword after you. Your land will be desolation. Your cities will be a waste. Verse 34, then the land shall enjoy its Sabbaths as long as it lies desolate. While you are in the enemy's land, then the land shall rest and enjoy its Sabbath. So this is all part of the covenant that God made in the law of Moses. You disobey me over and over and over again. Finally, I'm going to destroy your temple. I'm going to remove you from the land. I'm going to scatter you among the people. And finally, then, the land will be able to rest. It will be finally able to enjoy its Sabbaths. You may remember that every 7th year, the land was supposed to rest under the law of Moses. That probably never happened. And so God was finally going to make that happen by removing the people from the land so that the land could rest. But notice in that same passage, in Leviticus 26, verse 40, all that horrible stuff God's going to do because of the covenant and because of the people's disobedience. Verse 40, but if they confess, think Daniel chapter 9, if they confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their fathers and their treachery that they committed against me, and also walking contrary to me, right? If they humble, verse 41, 42, then I will remember my covenant with Jacob. I will remember my covenant with Isaac. I will remember my covenant with Abraham, and I will remember the land. So the land, verse 43, it will be abandoned and enjoy its Sabbaths and lie desolate. Okay, they will make amends for their iniquity because they spurn my rules. Yet, verse 44, for all of that, when they are in the land of their enemies, I will not spurn them. I will not abhor them, destroy them, or utterly break them apart. Verse 45, for their sake I will remember the covenant with their forefathers, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt in the sight of the nations, that I might be their God. I am the Lord. So, the end of the curses of the covenant is, even after all that, I'm going to bring them back, and if they confess their sins, which is going on in Daniel chapter 9. Okay, we're way over time, I think. So, we'll quit there, and we'll pick up there on next Wednesday. Thank you, guys.